Recently, some of my students have expressed an interest in having some videos that are to do with poetry, and specifically Edexcel's Anthology of Belonging. Now, what I thought I'd do was I'd do some context information about each of the poems. I'm going to separate it into two different videos which link to the two different groups. So one group is about place and identity, and the other group is to do with memory and nature. So this video is going to concentrate on those poems in the group of memory and nature and cover the context information for each. So first up, we're going to have To My Sister by William Wordsworth. Now, William Wordsworth was a romantic poet, and therefore his poems reflect the key themes of nature and the power of nature and our place within it. Now, if you can't remember, Romanticism was a movement that basically wrote about the love of nature and our own imagination and creativity. Now, this poem was written for his sister Dorothy in 1798. She lived with Wordsworth, as did a young boy called Basil, who was the son of a widower friend, and he's actually referred to in the poem and is called Edward in the poem. Around 1798, there was also a French and Dutch fleet which were threatening to invade the UK. And therefore, with this poem, Wordsworth is trying to kind of create a contrast with what was going on, the problems that were going on in society at the time. And he's reminding us how powerful nature truly is. He also encourages his sister Dorothy to embrace the healing power of nature. All right, so moving on to Captain Cook by Leitita Elizabeth Landon. Now, Landon lived in the countryside with her parents and her brother. Her brother was called Whittington Henry Landon, and they were really close when she was young and when they were both children. She supported him. She even paid for him to go to university. But unfortunately, he then started to distance himself from her, and it's said that he even spread rumours about her marriage, and therefore their relationship broke down. The family started off living in the countryside, but they were forced to move to London due to the agricultural depression. Now, we also need to think about Captain Cook in this poem. She refers to Captain James Cook, who was a renowned British explorer, and basically in this poem he represents that kind of sense of adventure and discovery. Next up is Sunday Dip by John Clare. Now, John Clare is another romantic poet, and this poem was written during the early 19th century and basically exemplifies the Romantics era of the celebration of nature and the innocence of childhood. He grew up in a small rural village and he had very little formal education. He was actually known as the peasant poet because he came from a working class family. The agricultural and industrial revolution in the 19th century was a real concern for Clare. He didn't like the way that it was causing disruption to rural communities and often uprooting many families. He had a deep affection for the countryside and for nature, and this poem shows his appreciation of the natural world. Mild the Mist Upon the Hill by Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte grew up in Yorkshire. Her mother died when she was young and therefore she was brought up by her father. She had siblings as well who he also brought up. She was known as a famous writer. You may know her book Wuthering Heights. Her sister Charlotte and Anne were also writers, and in her poetry and her prose she often explores the natural world and talks about themes of isolation and of longing. And she was influenced by the nature that surrounded her at home in Yorkshire. Clear and Gentle Stream by Robert Bridges. Robert Bridges was a doctor, but then he retired to become a poet, and he was actually poet laureate for the country between 1913 and 1930. He was a deeply religious man, and therefore lots of his poems show his strong Christian faith. Many of his poems were translated into hymns, and that includes this one, which was eventually set to music. His poetry often investigates themes of spirituality, nature, and the passage of time. Lastly, we have I Remember by Thomas Hood. Thomas Hood was a British poet and a humorist, best known for his puns and for his comic verse. A humorist is basically somebody who writes with humour in their work. I Remember appeared in the London magazine and is one of the most famous lyrical poems. He was writing at a time between the Romantic and the Victorian period, and so his poems address both the power of nature and innocence of childhood, along with the more realistic ideas of the Victorian poetry. Hood suffered from chronic illness and financial struggles throughout his life, and by the time he was 41, he was considered an invalid. Now, he wrote this poem in 1826 when he was 27, and I think that his bad health may explain why the poem has such sad and melancholic tone to it, and why there's this longing for his past and happier times. Now, as always, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and subscribe, and you'll see the next video.